Hey everybody, Desi Cooney here with Outlier Strength and Conditioning, and the topic of today's video is anterior pelvic tilt. So what is it? Does it always need correcting? And how do we correct it? Let's get into it. So as you can hopefully see here, an anterior pelvic tilt is simply a forward or anterior tipping of the pelvis as a whole, which can result in a lot of things, both up and downstream, but in particular, we're talking about the extension or overextension of the lumbar vertebrae in the lower back, and also the flaring of the rib cage usually coincides with that. The reason anterior pelvic tilt has come so much more into the spotlight recently as powerlifting has grown is because when people have this orientation in daily life and they get under a barbell and try to squat with it, it can result in all sorts of problems. It can result in pain and discomfort to the hips and lower back in particular. It can set you up for a potential injury to those areas or other areas. And probably the main reason that I see why it's not recommended to squat with this kind of a pelvic position without correcting it first is because it's going to make it very, very hard to hit depth, which, as we know in powerlifting, is absolutely essential to be able to get a good lift, at least in reputable federations. And so, if we look at squatting as a whole, this is a hip, knee, and ankle flexion exercise. So starting off an exercise like that in a degree of hip extension, like an anterior pelvic tilt, does not set you up for success and to be able to hit depth later on. And I think this is why we see so many people dramatically butt wink when they reach near depth or just around parallel. And it's because to get the depth that they require, the only way for them to be able to do that is for that pelvis to tuck back underneath them and out of that extended anterior tilted pattern. So I should point out that pain associated with an anterior pelvic tilted posture is not strictly paired with exercise. There are people that have this posture who don't exercise and probably still experience pain, and there's people with this posture that do exercise that might not be in pain. So I'm not saying that it's a one-to-one relationship, but I do think it's related. And we see this posture is really prevalent in today's society, and part of that is because of all this sitting we sort of do here in Western society. So sitting at desks, at work or school all day, sitting on the couch, sitting while you're driving in your car, all of that can exacerbate an anterior pelvic tilted posture. So it's really no surprise that people carry this with them when they go into the weight room and try to squat. But it can also be caused by something in the weight room. So think back, we all know the stereotypical high school football coach or early 2000s personal trainer who, not out of malice, but more out of negligence and misunderstanding, would cue people while they're squatting to aggressively arch the lower back, get the chest up, eyes up, and sit back as far as you can. Don't allow the knees to track over the toes, that sort of thing. And that kind of cueing really exacerbates an anterior pelvic tilted style. And while you're squatting, this can lead to pain and issues with the lower back and SI joints, stuff like that. But back in the day, people thought that if your knees went past your toes, that you would die. And now we know that that isn't true. So I could go on about this for hours and hours, but for the sake of this video, suffice it to say, I do not recommend that you arch your back super hard when you're squatting, and it is perfectly fine to let your knees track past your toes while you're squatting, and in fact, they probably will, and that's okay. You're gonna be fine as long as you're a healthy individual who's exercising properly. So how do we fix it? The answer is essentially learning to keep your pelvis in a more neutral orientation while you're squatting and less of an extended one. So the first thing you need to be able to do in order to do that is to learn how to brace. And I've made plenty of videos about this in the past, but to review, we want to keep the diaphragm and the pelvic floor directly opposing each other while we're squatting. And an external representation of that is that we want the distance between our sternum and our pelvis to be unchanging while we're squatting. We want that distance to remain the same. So essentially, if you can't stabilize your core with intra-abdominal pressure and your abdominal musculature, then you probably are going to rely on more of a compressive strategy of the lower back for some stability there, because that's simply all you have left to call upon. So number one, head and shoulders above the rest, is of course learn how to properly brace and create intra-abdominal pressure. So sometimes simple cues like saying ribs down or tuck your pelvis underneath you are going to be enough for some clients or athletes for you to get what you're looking for out of them position-wise. Other times it's probably going to take some special corrective exercises, if you will, just to bring awareness to that region. So some people simply lack the conscious motor control to be able to tilt their pelvis into the position you're looking for, because they've never had to do it before, or they're so used to carrying it a certain way. So I'll show you some of my favorites for corrective exercises. So number one would be some kind of a cat-camel variation. And I like this one because quite simply, you are just going through anterior and posterior tilting of the pelvis, so long as that's what you're cueing, and you're really bringing that under conscious control. So you're finding both end ranges, and you'll be able to find, a relatively neutral position somewhere in between them, and again, have conscious control over being able to do that when you exercise. So you can start kneeling, you can even progress this one to standing. It's just about getting that sensation down. Number two would be the feet up brace. And as you know, this is the start of my bracing progression typically. And I like this one because now we're integrating a neutral pelvic position with bracing. So instead of just consciously moving that pelvis back and forth, now we're actually using the hamstrings, using the abs, setting those in place and pulling the pelvis into a neutral position off the floor. And then of course you can carry that over into harder and harder variations. And then basically step three for me from there is going to be some sort of anteriorly loaded squat variation with heels elevated. So that could be a goblet squat, a counterbalance squat, Hatfield squat, anything where the center of mass is out in front of us. And heels elevated in addition to that is going to buy us more knee flexion, posterior or neutral pelvic tilting, and it's going to be just an easier position for people to be able to keep a good position of their ribs and pelvis and keep their brace. And then from there, all we need to do is progress back into their competition style squat and maintain those sort of patterns. And we simply do that by going through variations that push that center of mass further and further posteriorly. Well, thanks for tuning in, guys. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Guys, don't be someone who squats with an anterior pelvic tilt. It's not going to be conducive to you putting up a big squat pain-free. I promise you, your lower back does not have to hurt after every single squat session. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.